Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take the source material you've shared and explore the most important nuggets of knowledge and insight. This isn't just a summary. It's a custom-tailored exploration designed to help you become well-informed, fast.
And today we're diving into excerpts from Jordan Peterson's book, 12 Rules for Life. Our mission is really to extract the core ideas, maybe find some surprising connections, and just, understand why they seem to resonate so widely.
Yeah, it's a really interesting mix, isn't it? It draws on, everything from ancient biology to modern psychology and some very personal stories.
Absolutely. So we'll be looking at some of the key principles presented in the book, trying to get to the heart of their message as it's laid out in the sources you gave us.
Okay, sounds good. Let's unpack this. We're jumping right into the rules and some pretty unexpected reasoning behind them sometimes. So, where the source material kicks off is with something you might not expect at all. Lobsters. Rule number 1 is stand up straight with your shoulders back. And the book, it spends quite a bit of time connecting this simple advice to these crustaceans. What's the deal there?
Well, what's really fascinating, and the source lays this out pretty clearly, is the deep evolutionary link. Lobsters have incredibly old nervous systems, right? Scientists have actually mapped their neural circuits.
Okay.
And the surprise is how much their neurochemistry, especially around things like status and hierarchy, actually parallels more complex animals, including us humans. The source kind of says they have more in common with you than you might think, especially maybe when you're feeling a bit crabby.
Huh, okay. So it's about status then, like a pecking order, but underwater.
Exactly, yeah, like songbirds fighting over territory or chickens figuring out who's boss. Lobsters on the ocean floor are, constantly navigating dominance. This drive for position in some kind of hierarchy seems really fundamental across lots of species.
And the sources actually get specific about how this status thing is regulated, chemically speaking.
They do. It's tied to neurotransmitters. So a lobster that's, let's say, cocky, strutting, less likely to back down from a fight, that one's characterized by high serotonin and low octopamine. Octopamine is a related chemical.
Right.
And conversely, the defeated one, the sort of scrunched up, inhibited lobster, has low serotonin and high octopamine. Their posture quite literally reflects their chemical state and where they stand or crawl in the dominance hierarchy.
Okay, this is where it gets really wild, based on the source. The book points out that SSRI drugs, selective serotonin reuptake, inhibitors the kind prescribed for depression in humans. They have a similar chemical and behavioral effect on lobsters.
Yeah, they can actually cheer them up, basically. Alters their posture, makes them more willing to engage or fight.
Wow.
And that observation, it just highlights the incredibly deep evolutionary roots of our own neurochemistry when it comes to status and hierarchy. We're talking about systems that are like over 350 million years old. They predate dinosaurs.
350 million years.
Yeah. The structure of these dominance hierarchies, whether they're physical or social, has been an essentially permanent feature of the environment for complex life for a very, very long time.
And it doesn't just stop with biology, right? The source material links this ancient drive to wider patterns in human society. It brings in the Pareto principle.
Right, the Pareto principle, that idea that, a small percentage of participants often account for a large percentage of the outcomes. It's not just about wealth distribution. It shows up in how many authors write the most books, or how many scientific papers get published by just a few researchers, or how much music is produced by a handful of artists. That kind of unequal distribution seems common.
So the insight from Rule 1 is standing up straight isn't just about looking confident.
Well, it's tied into this ancient biologically rooted system related to status. It's about how we signal our position, our readiness to the world around us. The idea is your physical posture can influence not just how others see you, but potentially even your own neurochemistry. It's a feedback loop.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit. Let's talk about Rule 8. Tell the truth, or at least don't lie. The source presents this as, more than just a moral guideline. It's framed as something fundamental to psychological health, even societal health.
Yeah, the author shares a very personal, quite revealing story from his clinical training days. He described having this powerful realization that almost everything he was saying, it wasn't really driven by truth. It was motivated by wanting to win an argument or gain status or maybe manipulate a situation to get what he wanted.
That sounds like a tough realization.
He describes it as seeing himself as fundamentally fake. And that started him on this really difficult practice of trying to say only things his internal voice would not object to.
So trying to align speech with conscience.
Something like that. It was a struggle, he admits, especially when he wasn't sure what the truth was or what the right thing to do was. But the source suggests that choosing truthfulness, even if it meant admitting uncertainty, became his anchor.
I was struck by the part about working with paranoid clients. Why did that specific clinical experience make the need for truth so clear?
Well, according to the source, individuals experiencing paranoia are extremely sensitive detectors of, let's say, mixed motives or any hint of falsehood. Any whiff of inauthenticity could instantly shatter trust.
I see.
So it demanded that he be absolutely genuine in his reactions, even if the truth was maybe difficult or uncomfortable for the client to hear. And this radical honesty, even when it apparently scared him sometimes, was what ultimately built a foundation of trust.
The source also makes a strong case that lying doesn't just deceive others, it actually damages you.
Right. It argues that when you hide from others, when you present a false front, you're also kind of suppressing the potentialities of the unrealized self. That to really become who you could be, you have to engage genuinely with the world. You have to say something, go somewhere and do things.
Stasis is bad.
Stasis, or living a lie, leaves you incomplete. The book even mentions this idea that putting yourself in new, genuine situations can actually turn on new genes in your nervous system, building new structures in your brain. You literally grow through truthful engagement.
And the consequences of not doing that, of living or acting out a lie, they're presented pretty starkly in the source.
Oh, definitely. The source is very clear. It weakens your character at a fundamental level. So when adversity inevitably hits, and the book assumes it will hit, you won't have the internal strength that comes from grappling honestly with reality. You'll be easily mowed down.
There was that chilling example about the Gulag guards.
Exactly. The idea that seemingly ordinary people could become capable of horrific acts. The argument presented is that by the time the truth desperately needed speaking, those who might have spoken it had already compromised themselves through countless small lies and evasions, and there was essentially no one left capable of saying it.
So it connects individual dishonesty directly to the corruption of a whole state.
Precisely. It's a really powerful argument that these individual lies, these failures of integrity, they compound. They corrupt both the person and the society. The source contrasts this with figures like Solzhenitsyn, who chose to confront reality, to change his own life instead of just cursing fate, and maintained his integrity under extreme duress.
And his decision to tell the truth in the Gulag Archipelago.
The source argues that his decision to tell the unvarnished truth, as it puts it, played a significant role in ultimately shaking that pathological system to its core. Ideas have consequences.
So the takeaway is that telling the truth allows for genuine growth and adaptation.
That's what the source posits. By engaging truthfully with reality, your values and goals can actually transform as you learn and adapt. But if you build your life on lies, you become sort of a totalitarian ruler over your own flawed vision. You sacrifice the ability to discover if maybe there's a better path, a higher goal. You essentially blind yourself to potential.
Okay, so from speaking truth, let's shift to maybe the equally challenging task of hearing it. That brings us to Rule 9. Assume the person you are listening to might know something you don't. The source quotes Carl Rogers, the psychologist, who apparently believed most of us just cannot listen effectively.
Yeah, and that raises a really crucial question. Why is genuine listening so incredibly difficult? Rogers' perspective, as the source presents it, was kind of startling. He thought it was too dangerous.
Dangerous? How so?
Dangerous because if you truly listen, if you really open yourself up to understanding someone else's perspective, you run the risk of being changed yourself. You might actually see the world from their viewpoint, and that could influence you, make you question your own beliefs. So it requires significant courage to be that open. The source calls Rogers' observation here some of the most salutary words ever written on the topic. It's a high bar.
The source does offer a practical technique Rogers recommended, something the author apparently uses in his own practice.
Yes, the technique is basically this. Before you respond to someone in a discussion or argument, you have to first restate their ideas and feelings accurately. And not just accurately, but to their satisfaction. They have to agree, yes, you've understood me.
That sounds difficult.
Oh, incredibly difficult to do consistently in real life, the source emphasizes. But once they agree you've got it right, then you're allowed to offer your own perspective or critique.
What are the supposed benefits of forcing yourself to listen like that?
Well, the advantages, according to the source, are pretty compelling. First, it absolutely guarantees you've genuinely understood the other person, or at least forces you to try really hard. Second, The act of you articulating their thoughts back to them actually helps the speaker consolidate and process their own ideas.
Yeah.
It makes their memory of the experience more useful, helps them kind of derive the moral of the story for themselves.
Okay, that makes sense.
And crucially, it makes it almost impossible to construct a straw man argument, that easily defeated, distorted caricature of their actual position. You can't misrepresent them if you've just gotten them to agree you understand them.
So if you can actually state their position even better than they did.
Right. The source argues that if you can achieve that, you truly give the devil his due, so to speak. You're demonstrating profound respect for their viewpoint, even if you disagree. And that act opens the door for you to potentially learn something valuable, or, at the very least, if you still disagree, understanding their position so deeply allows you to hone your own arguments much more effectively against their actual points.
It sounds like shifting the goal away from just trying to win an argument.
Exactly. And towards a shared understanding, maybe even towards discovering a truth that neither person saw fully at the start. The source frames it as having a conversation aimed at mutual understanding and truth, not just a debate aimed at victory.
Like thinking itself.
Yeah, it suggests that even effective thinking works like this internally. It's like a dialogue between different potential views of the world inside your own head. It requires tolerating conflict, negotiating between ideas, and being willing to adjust your own perceptions, maybe even defeat your own flawed internal arguments. Now, the source material also spends a fair bit of time on the, let's say, complex topic of discipline, particularly for children. It moves beyond simple reward-punishment models and argues pretty strongly for the necessary role of, threats and punishment in shaping behavior effectively.
The argument seems to be that negative emotions aren't just, unpleasant side effects.
Yeah.
They're actually essential for learning, for protection.
Exactly. We feel pain or anxiety or shame or disgust for very good reasons, usually to help us avoid damage or social ostracism. Pain, the source notes, is often a much more potent teacher than pleasure, and anxiety can be more compelling than hope when it comes to immediate survival or action.
So based on that, what principles for discipline does the source lay out?
Okay, so first it says, limit the rules, keep them to a minimum. The idea being that having too many trivial or bad laws drives out respect for good laws. Focus on what's really important.
Makes sense. And second?
Second, use the minimum necessary force. This should be established experimentally, kind of like trial and error with your specific child. The source compares it to the legal principle, or Occam's razor. The simplest, least impactful intervention that works is usually best. But crucially, you have to be prepared to escalate if that minimum force isn't effective.
What kind of minimum rules does the source suggest are actually crucial? What's important?
The examples given focus mainly on behaviors that make a child, welcome everywhere they go. Socially acceptable stuff. Things like, don't hurt others physically biting, kicking, hitting, unless maybe it's clear self-defense. Don't torture, bully other kids. Learn to eat civilly. Learn to share toys and space. Pay attention when adults speak to you. Sleep properly. Take reasonable care of belongings and just generally try to be good company. Basic social skills.
And the minimum necessary force part, how does that play out?
Well, the source explains this can range hugely depending on the child and the situation. It might be just a stern look, the glare, or a clear verbal command, maybe physically removing them from a situation, like a timeout, or in what the source frames as rare but potentially necessary situations where immediate cessation is absolutely required to prevent a much worse outcome.
Like running into traffic.
Exactly. Like a child running into a busy parking lot or reaching for a hot stove or an electrical outlet. In those immediate danger situations, the source suggests it might even involve a quick swat on the behind. The core point it makes is that uncorrected, seriously antisocial behavior by age 4 tends to lead to increasingly severe penalties later in life. Social exclusion, trouble with peers, eventually maybe even legal consequences. Early intervention is key.
This seems to tie back to the idea that clear limits are necessary for development.
It does. A really critical point the source makes is that the word no only has real meaning if there's a credible threat of some kind of punishment or negative consequence behind it. For adults, this backing comes from social norms, reputation, maybe the law. For young children, it primarily comes from a parent's authority. And ultimately, if needed, their physical ability to enforce the limit.
So without that potential consequence?
Without that potential consequence, the source argues no means basically nothing. Or worse, it signals to the child that limits are just suggestions, easily ignored, which doesn't prepare them for a world that does have real consequences.
And the flip side, The book argues that too much protection is also a problem.
Yes, that's a fascinating part. The argument is that too much protection devastates the developing soul. The source uses the fairy tale of Hansel and Gretel as a kind of symbolic exploration here.
How so? The witch.
Yeah, the witch isn't just presented as pure evil. She can also be interpreted, according to the source, as a symbol of the terrible mother archetype representing the potentially devouring, smothering aspect of the symbolically feminine. This force and this interpretation prevents the child from developing independence, consciousness, self-determination. It keeps them dependent.
Like an Oedipal thing.
Sort of. It turns what might be seen psychologically as an individual Oedipal nightmare, being kind of stuck, dependent on the parent, unable to venture out into a potential societal issue if that pattern of overprotection gets enacted too broadly, say through social policy or cultural norms. It hinders growth of very capable individuals.
Okay, shifting again, the deep dive into the sources also touches on, well, the heavy and pretty much unavoidable reality of suffering in life. The book shares some incredibly poignant, difficult details from the author's own family, specifically his daughter, Michaela's, long and harrowing struggle with severe juvenile arthritis.
Yeah, it describes years of chronic, debilitating pain, multiple major joint replacement surgeries, complications like infection, and then the absolutely brutal challenges of managing powerful painkillers and dealing with the withdrawal symptoms, things like night sweats, agitation, even the sensation of insects crawling under her skin. It sounds horrific.
It really does. And this deeply personal narrative, it grounds the source's point that tragedy and catastrophe aren't just abstract possibilities. For many people, they are inescapable parts of life. And, the demands of everyday existence, paying bills, going to work, they don't just pause because you're facing a crisis.
Right. Life goes on even when it feels impossible.
But the source draws some very practical wisdom from navigating this kind of profound difficulty. What are some of those strategies mentioned?
One key idea that comes through is the importance of setting aside a specific, limited time each day just to think and talk about the crisis, to grapple with it, maybe make plans, discuss how it should be managed with your partner or family.
Okay, scheduling the worry.
Essentially, yes. And crucially, outside of that scheduled time, you make a conscious effort to strictly avoid dwelling on it. You compartmentalize to conserve strength.
And the reasoning behind that structured approach, why does that help?
The source suggests that the parts of our brain that generate anxiety are often somewhat satisfied just knowing that there is a plan, that the problem is being addressed at a specific time. Even if the plan isn't perfect or all the details aren't known, it calms the system slightly.
And scheduling it right is important.
Definitely. Scheduling this crisis time outside of the evening is vital, the source stresses, because everything goes downhill very fast if you can't sleep due to constant worry. Protect your sleep.
That makes sense. And there was another piece of advice, too, about how you frame your experience during really prolonged suffering.
Yes, it's about shifting the unit of time you use to organize your life when things are truly bad. So instead of trying to make long-term plans or constantly worrying about the distant future, which can be overwhelming,
you focus on the immediate.
Exactly. You focus on managing sufficient unto the day are the evils thereof, as the saying goes. You attend to your immediate responsibilities, just getting through the next hour, maybe the next day. You shorten your time horizon drastically without being completely overwhelmed by the enormity of the future suffering or uncertainty.
Like fighting one battle at a time in a long war.
That's a good analogy the source uses. You have to stay functional through each immediate challenge to survive the longer campaign. Now, while a lot of the focus is on these individual rules and navigating personal challenges, the source material also definitely expands outwards, connecting these ideas to broader societal dynamics and some pretty current trends.
Right. It offers perspectives on observed differences between genders and how those might manifest in areas like education and relationships.
Yeah. The source points to studies, particularly highlighting those done in seemingly very egalitarian societies like in Scandinavia, where social factors are theoretically minimized. And even there, it notes, researchers find statistically significant average differences in things like occupational interests and personality traits like agreeableness between men and women.
And it links these observed average differences to some trends we see, like the increasing gender skew in certain university programs.
Right. And the source goes on to discuss potential challenges this might pose, particularly for women seeking partners in the modern landscape. It ties this into what it describes as well-documented preferences, on average, for employed or higher status mates, and connects it to the changing economic realities of marriage. It notes marriage is increasingly becoming something reserved for couples with higher combined incomes.
There was a specific point about unemployed men.
Yes, the source explicitly states that an unemployed working-class man is often seen as an undesirable partner, partly because, from an evolutionary or biological perspective, women, particularly when they have children, become more vulnerable and have a deep-seated need for a competent, stable partner who can provide resources and support.
The source also takes time to impartially examine common criticisms of concepts like patriarchy. It offers a different interpretation.
It does. From the perspective presented in the source, it suggests that viewing history simply as male tyranny over women is inaccurate. Instead, it frames history more as an imperfect, difficult collective struggle by both sexes against the fundamental challenges of privation, scarcity, disease, and hard labor.
So not oppression, but a shared struggle.
That's the argument presented. It also points to major technological shifts, like the invention and widespread availability of reliable birth control, as incredibly significant factors that have fundamentally altered societal dynamics and power balances between the sexes, often more so than purely political movements. The source argues that culture itself isn't solely the creation of men, but of humankind, and it pushes back against what it sees as overly simplistic narratives of historical oppression.
And the source really doesn't shy away from connecting what it views as flawed ideas directly to real-world consequences, sometimes terrible ones.
No, it doesn't. It provides some pretty chilling historical accounts to argue very strongly that ideas do have consequences, sometimes absolutely horrific ones, especially when abstract ideologies are implemented on a large scale and fail to align with, well, basic reality or fundamental aspects of human nature.
It cites specific examples.
Yes, citing examples related to the implementation of ideologies like Marxism in places like Cambodia under Pol Pot or the Soviet Union. The source argues that such systems often stem from, or are perpetuated by, a kind of deliberate substitution of flawed concepts. It notes, for instance, postmodern thinkers like Derrida substituting the concept of power for money as the central explanatory force in society, arguing this was a way to maintain a critique of societal structures even after figures like Solzhenitsyn had, in its view, thoroughly exposed the economic and human horrors of communism. The core message is that bad ideas, when taken seriously, can lead to catastrophe.
Wow. Okay, we've covered a really vast territory in this deep dive, haven't we? From the ancient hardwired biology of lobsters and status hierarchies.
Right, all the way to the modern challenges of relationships, the necessity of truth, and the potentially devastating consequences of ideologies that ignore or deny human nature.
We've touched on the power of standing tall, literally and metaphorically. The absolute necessity of truthfulness for shaping both individual character and maybe even society itself.
Yeah, and the courage required to truly listen, to actually risk being changed by understanding someone else. We talked about that delicate, sometimes difficult balance of discipline and protection needed to foster capable, independent individuals.
And drawing that practical wisdom for navigating life's inevitable suffering, those strategies for coping when things get really tough.
It all seems to circle back, in the source material, to this fundamental idea that confronting reality, honestly, even the difficult, painful, or complex parts, and striving for personal integrity, that's what helps us live more meaningful, capable lives.
And as the source reflects on finding moments of light even in the midst of darkness, it offers that really striking final image, doesn't it? Encountering a cat on the street.
Yeah, and just taking a moment to pet it. A simple, voluntary act of appreciating a small, good thing in what can often feel like a difficult and challenging world. It's about actively choosing to see and engage with the good that still exists, however small.
Which leaves you with that final, quite powerful question taken straight from the source. What will you write with your pen of light?
Makes you think. What insights did you take away from this deep dive into the sources? We definitely encourage you to keep exploring these complex ideas yourself.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive.